Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be exposing the lies and the hatred behind Israel Apartheid Week that is at so many of our British campuses. Warm welcome to the programme, and my guests today, Jonathan Ferrell, the Director of Student Affairs at StandWithUs UK, and Charlotte Korchak, who's the Director of International Student Programmes at StandWithUs Israel. So welcome to the programme. Jonathan, you've been on this programme before, but many of our viewers may recognise you, Charlotte, for being in that excellent documentary called The Quest for Truth, in which you showed those international students the truth about Israel's situation. So I'll start off with you. You're an American, you're born in California. Tell us about Jewish life in California and how you ended up in Israel.
Well, Jewish life in California is a thriving Jewish community. It's the third largest Jewish community, I believe, in the world, in Los Angeles. So I guess you can say I grew up in a very classic Jewish bubble, as we call it. Started off in Beverlywood in Los Angeles, which is a very famous Jewish community. There's actually one block in that area of 1 mile where you have countless kosher restaurants and synagogues, just one after the other after the other. When I would walk to synagogue, I would walk by like 6 other synagogues to get to mine. So it was a thriving Jewish community. But when I turned 9 years old, a little bit after that, my parents decided to make Aliyah, to move to Israel, to immigrate to Israel. And I found myself, I guess you could say, in another Jewish bubble. Living in, well, Israel, but really living in Judea and Samaria, in a settlement in the West Bank in a Jewish community. We lasted there for a year, just because it was just too small of a town for us. We came from a huge city, and we found ourselves in a city of a town of about 300 families, and it was just too small for us. So we very quickly, after a year, made our way to Jerusalem, the biggest city in Israel, and lived there for another 4 years. Challenging times. We moved to Jerusalem in 1998. Things were quieting down, I guess you can say, from the violence of the Oslo Accords. And then, unfortunately, in the year 2000, they picked up again. And I found myself as a 13-year-old and 14-year-old kid living in an environment of terrorism. The second Intifada, the second big uprising by Palestinians, had begun starting in September of 2000. I had just turned 13 years old, and all of a sudden, my reality became a reality of violence. Buses that I took every day were being blown up. Restaurants that I ate out on a very consistent basis were being blown up. The marketplace, where almost all Israelis who live in Jerusalem shop to buy our vegetables and our spices and everything in between, suffered over 15 suicide bombings. And I guess you can say that I was really thrust into the conflict. And when I really understood what was going on was the day that a suicide bomber walked up to a group of my friends who were out eating pizza on a Saturday night and blew himself up. I lost 3 friends that day. Well, 2 friends were killed that night, and one of my friends had suffered a wound. The bomber had packed his bomb with nails and screws, which was a very common tactic during the Intifada of suicide bombers, because they wanted to cause as much carnage as possible. And so I had a lot of friends with shrapnel wounds, but one friend suffered 1 nail wound to the head, and she unfortunately died of her wounds 10 days later. So that was, again, like I said, my intro into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I guess you can say that's a big part of me does what I do every single day in their memory. They don't have a voice anymore, but I have one, and it's loud, and I intend to use it for as long as possible. So that was my life in Israel. I also want to add, though, that as much as we talk a lot about terrorism in Israel, we also have to note that it is an incredibly thriving community, and it's one of the best places to live, which, I mean, funny enough, after the Intifada, during the Intifada, my family moved back to the States, but I found my way back to Israel 10 years later, and I didn't even hesitate to move there again. It wasn't even a question. Israelis know how to live life every single day to the fullest because we understand how fragile it is and how we should never take a second of it for granted. And that's really what the Second Intifada taught me. Taught me to appreciate every moment, to appreciate the people that you have in your life. I learned to never hang up the phone or leave my parents without telling them that I loved them, just in case that's the last thing that we ever hear each other say. So, you know, we sometimes paint this picture of Israel and people get afraid to go there. And I never want to paint that picture because go there. It is an incredible place. And in fact, today I would say it's a very safe place as well. So.
I would agree with you, but being in Israel at that time as well was incredibly dark and also dangerous. So thank you for sharing your experiences as well. And Jonathan, it's been over a year since you've been on this programme, so welcome back. So can you share with us some of the activities that you've been involved in terms of Israel and countering the lies and hatred that are at so many of our British universities?
Fantastic. Well, thank you for having me. Since I last came on the programme, Stand With Us UK, was privileged to have started what we call the Emerson Fellowship, which is a nationwide leadership programme for university students, and actually began first in the United States. It's been going for about 10 years. And now as the director of that nationwide programme, we have 17 of the top leading Jewish and non-Jewish students who love Israel, who care about Israel, who are seeking to change the conversation on campus. So this year we've been doubling our efforts to make a change for Israel on campus, and one of the key activities that we've been involved in is a campaign called Peace Week UK. And this campaign really came as a result of my Israel Peace Week campaign when I was a student at the University of Exeter in 2017, because I felt that there really needed to be an opportunity to engage positively about Israel on campus, to cut through sort of the hatred and cut through the animosity that very much surrounded the discussion, and also expose people to the real positive changes that Israelis and Arab Israelis are working towards in Israeli society today, because that was a conversation that I didn't really hear happening on campus. So we've taken that sort of model and we've expanded it nationwide, and so now we're running activities on over dozens of campuses across the UK to really provide that alternative platform for Jewish and non-Jewish students to engage with Israel in a way that isn't clouded in hatred and animosity towards Israel and ultimately Jewish students who identify with Israel on campus.
Excellent. So let's have a look now at some of the excellent work being carried out by Stand With Us.
You feel the connection deeply. The pride and the people inspire you. You yearn for peace and hope that your children and your grandchildren will love and support Israel. You want to inspire them to care as you do, to protect Israel's future. Do you take for granted that they will know what you know and feel what you feel? Do they know how far we have come, where we've been, where we're going? Will they be inspired and rise to the task? Will they stand tall for Israel? Will they understand? Never again. Our students on university campuses are being attacked for their support of Israel.
What are the Jewish people doing right now? Are you doing enough to stop your racist, apartheid, genocidal state?
They attack our children, our communities, your children, your communities. Every day requires courage and strength. They are told that they don't belong. Criminal! 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 And that their voices don't matter.
Get off our campus now! I've been in this campus for 10 years! Get the f*** off our campus now!
That our history, our nation, our people don't matter. You want to stand tall, to make a difference, to make sure that our pride shines through, that our children and our neighbours and their children will know who we are, to show a legacy of pride, strength and peoplehood. This is what Stand With Us does. That is who Stand With Us is. We represent you when you can't be there, with 18 offices around the globe and in 40 locations around the country, from Exeter, Brighton and London to Birmingham, Manchester and Aberdeen. We represent you in schools where we reach thousands of students each year with the beauty of Israel and foster the next generation of Zionist leaders. We're your voice on campus, training students how to lead and reach over 5,000 of their peers each year in the face of intolerance and bigotry. We represent you when we reach 100 million people on Facebook during peak weeks. We educate for the future by sponsoring speaking tours and holding conferences across the UK, training leaders and lifting communities. We run leadership courses for university and sixth form students, encouraging them to become active leaders, initiating more than 50 campus projects a year. We work with synagogues and communities in innovative and interactive family courses. We are your hotline when rights are trampled on and emergency help is needed, with professional, legal and hands-on support, standing by for students, faculty and community members. We represent you when we work with hundreds of students and community members across the UK. We are working in your name when we launch nationwide campaigns to counter anti-Semitism, the boycott movement, and to educate for peace. We represent you when it's time to push back, when it's time to share Israel's story, when it's time to teach, to stand up, to show undying pride for Israel. And we have only just begun. Help us reach more of the UK. Help us empower more of our children, your children, to be courageous, to be confident, to fight smart, to win, and to always, always stand tall.
So if you're a student and you're at university, then I strongly recommend you get in touch with Stand With Us, because I'm pretty sure that Israel needs you on campus. Charlotte, you're here really to discuss something horrific, really, and this is Israel Apartheid Week, in which Israel is accused of being an apartheid state. We know this is lies. This is just designed to stir up hatred towards Israel on campus, and really has nothing to do about increasing awareness about the plight of Palestinians at all. It's just an attempt to attack Israel. But can you tell us about Israel Apartheid Week, its origins, how it started, and also the damage it's doing in terms of Israel and the Jewish people on campus?
Sure. So Israel Apartheid Week started out in Canada, actually. It was really an effort that came about starting towards the tail end of the Second Intifada, which for us, obviously, we talk about it as a time where Israel was suffering. Israel was going through, countless terrorist attacks. Over 1,000 Israelis were murdered, lost their lives during these years. But what we saw in the media was a very different story. It was a story of, Israel's reaction to those terrorist attacks, but it wasn't framed as the reaction. It was kind of framed as the reason for the terrorist attacks, where everything was kind of flipped on its head. And that really, all of a sudden, brought up these activists who decided to come out and start to really demonize Israel. And so it started out as, you could actually say, kind of mild. On my campus, it was actually called Palestinian Awareness Week. They made it sound much more polite, and then eventually it evolved into Israel Apartheid Week. And what it usually encompasses is a week of events that usually include on campus, really in center areas on the college campus, with what we would call either street theater or displays that are put up on campus. Oftentimes an apartheid wall will be put up, which is a structure that on it is panel after panel that just says very oftentimes horrific things about Israel. Oftentimes things that are true but are wildly taken out of context, which is a very dangerous way of going about things, because me as an innocent student, if I go and I see that, I can then Google it, and I see that it's true, but I don't know the whole story. And so you have the apartheid wall, you'll have street theater, like people dressing up like Israeli soldiers and, beating people. There was a display in the center of Columbia University in New York City where they literally lined people up who were obviously actors who were taking part in this, and they blindfolded them, and you had people dressed up like Israeli soldiers walking behind them, kind of kicking them, throwing them down to the ground. And it's, again, it's theater. And it really just demonizes Israel. And then usually it will also include people coming as speakers who will come and either at the display itself will spew hatred of Israel, demonize Israel, delegitimize the existence of the state of Israel. So it's a week of hate. It's a week of hate, and I encountered it. That's actually how I got involved with Israel activism. When I started out at USC, the University of Southern California, I was completely unaware of an anti-Israel movement until it was late March, I think, of 2006 on my first year at university, and I was walking on campus and I saw the apartheid wall. And the thing that stuck out on it more than anything else to me was Zionism is racism, and the worst was end Zionism now, which if you struggle with defining Zionism, which many people do, you don't realize that that's actually calling for the state of Israel to not exist anymore. And so this is just vile, vile hatred. And it's, like you said, not encouraging a conversation about the Palestinian plight. You know, on my campus, it was called Palestinian Awareness Week. I wasn't made aware of anything Palestinian during that week. All I saw was a delegitimization and demonization of Israel. And only one side of the story. And so really what we try to do at Stand With Us is not only respond to it, but also be proactive in the conversation and try to really engage in dialogue and do things leading up to Israel Apartheid Week well before that is proactive, that's starting the conversation before the hatred, and really trying to show people that there is a much bigger story here. And funny enough, I actually think we're the ones who very oftentimes talk about the plight of the Palestinians more than they do, because I always say I'm pro-Israel, but I'm also pro-Palestinian. And I want their lives to get better, and I don't want them to be suffering. But we have to talk about why they're suffering and under who they're suffering. Absolutely. And the blame is just constantly thrown at Israel. And we need to widen that conversation. So that's Apartheid Week. It is unfortunately a horrible thing that we see every year popping up on campuses throughout the world, and not just in the UK and not just in the United States. And probably the most challenging place that we see it is in South Africa itself. So this is something that we are actively trying to fight against, but it is probably the week where we see the most amount of Israel hatred throughout the entire year.
And Jonathan, it was pretty bad in my time when I was at university over 20 years ago. But we didn't have anything like Israel on Apartheid Week on campus. There was so much hostility towards Israel. Even the Islamic Society tried to ban the Jewish Society because of its association with Israel, for example. And of course, people didn't like that. So, and that was over 20 years ago. And I can imagine the climate has got a lot worse. So, drawing on your own experience at Exeter, what did you experience at Exeter University, a university I know very well?
Absolutely. So when I was at Exeter University from the years 2013 to 2017, I experienced so much of the hatred from the kind of atmosphere that's created around Israel Apartheid Week. Now, Exeter, I'd like to say, was very unique in sort of the extent of the anti-Semitism and the issues that we experienced, but unfortunately it's not. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. Sure. In 2017, leading up to Israel Apartheid Week, there were a number of actually anti-Semitic incidences independent of that week that occurred. One of them was the carving of a swastika on a student's dorm room, and a number of other incidents. We had a student representative from Gaza who had made very pro-Hamas comments, who was very involved with the Palestinian Society on campus, make very nasty and very insightful comments that were targeting the Jewish community, and that's definitely how the Jewish community received it. As part of my attempts alongside the Jewish Society to counter the hatred and also to bring awareness to the university that the event of Israel Apartheid Week wasn't going to do nothing to help build relationships on campus. It wasn't going to abide by the university's guiding principles of ensuring that all students feel included and respected, and it wasn't going to help protect the welfare of Jewish students on campus. And so I'm grateful that I got a chance to speak to the University Vice-Chancellor, and he actually cancelled Israel Apartheid Week in Exeter. But that was because there was a plan by the Friends of Palestine Society to host one of these apartheid walls that Charlotte was talking about, where they were planning to dress up in IDF uniforms and target students to experience what they say is the legitimate expression of what happens at university checkpoints. And actually the university overrode the decision of the student union to allow that to go ahead, citing the fact that it was inevitably going to discriminate against students and be an act of fear and intimidation. So that's just one of the incidences that we faced at Exeter, but unfortunately that is replicated at universities all across the country. And what Israel Apartheid Week does at its most challenging for us is that it creates an atmosphere where lies can be told and legitimized as criticism of Israel. And this is what we as Stand With Us UK, and what I do as part of my work with students, is countering the fact that all across the UK we have Israel Apartheid Week events throughout the year, really, that legitimize attempts to delegitimize Israel and the Jewish people and their right to self-determination, but camouflaging it as political criticism. And we're there to call it out and to provide a real effective education to counter that.
Fantastic. So let's have a look at this disturbing video now. This, according to my notes here, this is Israel Apartheid Week at Sussex University, produced by Uni TV from Student Television. So let's have a look at some of the activities that we see across our country on campuses throughout the UK during Israel Apartheid Week.
The Israeli-Palestinian issue is one of the most contentious international conflicts in the world today. With over 40 years of occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, a solution to the dispute seems even more problematic now than it has been ever in the past. With existing Israeli policies of settlement expansion and a very fractured Palestinian leadership, the dispute seems far away from being solved any time in the near future. Israeli Apartheid Week is a campus-based initiative that started in Toronto, Canada, over 5 years ago and has now expanded to over 50 universities across the world in North America, Europe, the West Bank, and Gaza. The campaign was formed to raise awareness to Israeli policies of settlement building on Palestinian land, the creation of the highly controversial wall in the West Bank, and to the existing occupation of Arab lands that includes the Golan Heights.
If you look at apartheid systems historically, I think South Africa and America in the 1950s and 60s, and look at Israel, I think what comes to mind is sort of a segregation of two culturally similar but also different groups, and the creation of second-class citizenship, unequal legal representation, and unequal civil liberties. And I think that that's definitely what's going on in Israel.
I think it's a really interesting and contentious issue. And I would really like to learn more about it. I think I don't know enough to actually form an opinion. So I think the events that are going on would really be helpful to kind of see what the real issue is and what's happening around it.
What's he want from us? I just want to go and see my brother.
The Palestine Society here at Sussex have recreated an Israeli checkpoint, a security barrier portraying the treatment of Palestinian citizens. Its detractors argue of daily human rights abuses and humiliating behavior of Palestinian citizens. Its proponents, however, say that it is vital to Israel's security against attacks on its citizens. Would you say this is an accurate representation of what happens at checkpoints in Israel?
Well, it's quite a good representation. They're not really using enough violence to show the reality over there. And plus, in these situations, you could actually get shot, you know. Like, you could get shot if, like, probably you saw one of them trying to speak up or stand up. This doesn't really happen. Like, a Palestinian is not allowed, and they know that if they do that, they will get arrested and they will get shot, probably.
I do firmly believe that there are people on both sides that have been taken unwillingly to wear, you know, uniforms and go and shoot other people. You know, I am from the country where a lot of my friends have been snatched out, you know, from their beds in the night without having any choice, you know, wearing uniforms and going and killing other people in order not to be killed themselves, you know. And I think, you know, the enactments like this, you know, are kind of quite careless towards people that have been through it.
In response, there tends to be a divided opinion on the activities of the campaign. Its critics argue that it is not only a false reflection of the current situation in Gaza and the West Bank, but is highly offensive by using the suffering under the old apartheid regime in South Africa to demonize the State of Israel and its supporters. Many have termed the week-long event as biased, anti-Israeli, and perhaps anti-Semitic too. Amidst the debate and controversy surrounding the event, many have come in support of the initiative. Some have gone so far to claim that the term apartheid is not only an overstatement, but an understatement, arguing that the situation in the occupied territories is worse than South African apartheid.
Well, I think the element of comparison is definitely relevant to the situation, although making a complete analogy between the two situations is taking things a bit too far. I've never heard people say that describing Israel as an apartheid state was delegitimizing the whole Palestinian struggle, because elements that belong obviously to the situation in apartheid are what they are, and they have been atrocious. But in a similar way, what's happening in Palestine is also in the same vein as that. I mean, the occupation of the land, the unfair treatment of Palestinians, the way they don't kind of possess the same rights as citizens of Israel, but also as just Palestinian, their right to travel, the way they're exploited by Israeli companies. All of this kind of makes us think that the term apartheid is applicable to Palestinians too.
There are debates about whether Israeli state is an apartheid state, but those people who contest this description normally have a very legal description and understanding of what apartheid is. However, if you take a broader understanding of apartheid in terms of politically enforced segregation of a population on the basis of race, color, religion, or other affiliation, then you could see that Israeli practices amount to apartheid practices, in fact, in the occupied territories, whether in terms of limiting or preventing access to various services, to natural resources, to water, to health, to education, to work. So on all these levels you could observe that there are discrimination systematically enforced and upheld by Israeli legal system.
And this is why we have to counter so much of the lies, hatred and misunderstanding so many of our British university campuses during Israel Apartheid Week. Charlotte, I know that video wound you up, so I'm giving you the opportunity then to respond to what's been said and the reenactment of so-called Israeli soldiers at checkpoints and what have you. So tell us the truth.
Wow, where to start? First and foremost, checkpoints. Checkpoints aren't pleasant. I think everyone would admit that. I think me as an Israeli, I wish I could live in a world where they didn't exist. I wish that Palestinians didn't have to go through them. I wish that I didn't have to go through them. But there's a reason that checkpoints exist. There was terrorism. There is terrorism. Israel day to day is being threatened by terrorism. And checkpoints are a very effective method to stop people from being able to enter into Israel, and I know people, from stopping terrorists from being able to enter into Israel and commit terrorist attacks against Israelis. Now, today, the vast majority of checkpoints rest along the Green Line, allowing Palestinians who have work permits in Israel to enter into Israel. And I think no one would disagree that every country in the world has the ability and the right to protect their sovereignty. And if somebody's going to enter into your sovereign territory, that you have the ability to stop them, check them, and make sure that they don't have anything harmful that can cause harm to your citizens. Checkpoints within the West Bank exist for the purpose of, again, being able to stop terrorist movement within that territory and stop terrorist weaponry or bombs from being able to move within that territory. It's a necessary measure. And I would say that, unfortunately, it's a necessary measure. And I think Israel has done a lot to try to improve the conditions at checkpoints, to try to make the experiences at checkpoints better and better for Palestinians, with the reality that they're necessary, but we don't want to cause harm. We don't want to cause humiliation, which did happen. I mean, anyone would admit it, that there were times where Palestinians would suffer harassment at checkpoints or humiliation at checkpoints. It pains me to see somebody say that what they were showing wasn't violent enough, because we're not trying to be violent at checkpoints. We're just trying to make sure that terrorists can't act freely within these territories and commit terrorist attacks against Israelis and against any human being. As much as they say they have their human rights, which they do, and we do our best to uphold them, we also have our human rights. We have the right to live. Now, the other claim is obviously the claim of apartheid, where, somebody said, well, if you look at the broader way of defining apartheid, which is racial segregation, I think the crucial word there is racial. The separation that has occurred within the West Bank, within Judea and Samaria, is by nationality, Palestinians and Israelis. Meaning that, yes, there are areas where Israelis can go and territory where Palestinians can go, but it's not Jews and Arabs. Israeli Arabs drive on the same roads as Israeli Jews in those territories. And then we really have to dive deeper and say, but why is there separation at all? Which is a very legitimate question. And it happened for two reasons. One, because we're two different people and oftentimes you like to live amongst your own, but also because of security. This wasn't done because of racism. This wasn't done to completely separate people because we hate them and it's an us versus them. It was done because there was terrorism and there was violence. And so there are roads that Israelis can drive on that Palestinians can't, because for years those roads were used as places where Palestinians would stand on the side of the road and throw rocks or Molotov cocktails at vehicles, really forcing Israel to then stop them from being able to use those roads. That's a sad reality. That's not something that Israel wanted to do. There were times where we all drove on the same roads, but once those terrorist attacks began, measures had to be put in place to try to prevent them. The use of the term apartheid is done for the purpose of demonizing Israel. If you want to talk about racism and discrimination, we can talk about it. Those are things that exist within this conflict, because ultimately conflicts sometimes will breed that and separation will breed that. But it's not apartheid. And the use of the word, to me, actually demeans the many blacks in South Africa who actually suffered under a real apartheid system. I'm not saying that it's ideal. I'm not saying that it's perfect. I'm definitely not saying that the situation should remain as it is. And we can talk about all of that. And that's what we encourage when we go to campuses. We say, let's talk about the real issues. Let's talk about how we can actually move forward and change the reality. But every time you put us in this category of apartheid, you're pushing us further away from being able to have a real conversation about what's actually going on, because you're just demonizing Israel and you're creating a reality where it's Israel's wrong, they're right. Israel's the oppressor, they're the victim. And that's just not the case here. There are victims on both sides of this conflict. And I want to address one more claim that was brought up, which is this idea that terrorists become terrorists because they're forced into this reality. Now, I agree that they are, but not from pulling them out of their beds and forcing them into being a terrorist. But unfortunately, Palestinians suffer from incitement from their own government, where they are from a very young age raised with TV shows, children's shows, a Mickey Mouse lookalike that's telling them to become terrorists, that's telling them that to become a man, to become an honorable person within their society, that they should go and become a martyr. And that creates terrorists, not someone who's doing it because they're afraid that they're going to be killed, but someone who genuinely believes in it because from the moment that they were born, they were brainwashed to believe this. And that, to me, is the saddest part of this reality. And it's something that goes unchecked, and most people either don't know or ignore that reality and choose to blame Israel. And to me, we work for an education organization. Stand With Us, it preaches that education is the road to peace. And I firmly believe that. And I believe that every single day that a child within the Palestinian areas is raised to hate is another day that we are further and further away from peace. And it will take a generation to be able to correct the brainwashing that has been done, for us to be able to get to a place where we might even be close to being able to discuss a peaceful resolution in the future. So this is just a wild mischaracterization of what's going on in Israel. And if you notice, there was not one person in that video who presented Israel's side. And that's one of the biggest problems here, is that all they're telling you is one side of the story and misrepresenting that side of the story without telling that full picture, that full context within which all of these things are taking place.
Excellent analysis. Thank you, Charlotte. And Jonathan, when we're discussing organisations like the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, the many other Palestinian societies that are at our campus universities, they seem to get away with telling absolutely outrageous lies against Israel, especially accusing Israel of being a racist or apartheid state. But don't they fall foul of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism? And therefore, by saying these things, they're actually showing themselves to be what they are, Jew haters.
Well, absolutely. There's when you sort of begin to do this work and you begin to talk to people on campus during these times, you realise that the views that even that they expressed during Apartheid Week are as horrific as they are a cover for more insidious views like Zionism is racism, that the Jewish people aren't even a people, that the people in Israel have no right to be there under any circumstance. In fact, me and Charlotte were just in Exeter University yesterday to help support one of our UK Emerson Fellows in countering the hate that we anticipate to be communicated during Israel Apartheid Week. And what they did is they created this fantastic engagement activity called the Israelometer, where we were taking a poll of the student population. And we had students that came up to us angry that we were even offering a discussion about Israel at all. And one of the things that they were saying, one of the questions that we asked them to comment on was, does Israel have a right to defend itself? And we had quite a few students that came up to me and said, no, Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. And I challenged them and I say, in any circumstance, and they'd say, in any circumstance. And we would communicate to them facts about the violence that Israeli civilians have been victim of during the First and Second Intifada, and even then, they would say, no, Zionism is racism, and Israel has no right to defend itself in any circumstance. So there is a real insidious and, I think, anti-Semitic core to a lot of the ideas that are perpetuated in Israel Apartheid Week.
And Charlotte, I have to ask you really about the real apartheid that's taking place in the Middle East, and that is the apartheid of fellow Arab states and in their treatment of Palestinians living in Lebanon, living in Syria, living in Iraq. Even in Iraq, they face ethnic genocide and ethnic cleansing, and yet there's complete silence when it comes down to the treatment of Palestinians, say, living in camps in Syria where they've been bombed by Assad's regime. Complete silence. So why is there complete hypocrisy when the Palestinians living in other parts of the Middle East are treated worse than third-class citizens? And who built the Palestinian infrastructure? The Israelis did. They built their roads, they built their schools, they built their hospitals, they gave them an education system. None of that was in place. And what is the only state that's actually offered the Palestinians their own sense of nationalism, the opportunity to have their own state? Israel. The Jordanians didn't do it. The Egyptians didn't do it when they're in control of Gaza and Judea and Samaria. So do they fundamentally care about the Palestinians, or is this just a big front and a cover to hate Israel?
I think that's a hard question to answer, I think, because I don't like painting anything with one broad stroke. I think that a lot of people have different motivations. So, first of all, I'm very sensitive to the use of the word apartheid in any context, unless it really does reflect what happened in South Africa, just because using that term, I think, denigrates it if it doesn't actually fit. It's like kind of saying Holocaust when you're not talking about something that's comparable to the Holocaust, which I would argue there has been nothing comparable to the Holocaust. And so we need to be just a little careful with our language. But in general, I think there are absolutely people who do it because they actually care about the Palestinians. I think there are. I think those people see the news and they see Israel and they think Israel is to blame and they target Israel. And I think they probably are incredibly ignorant and unfortunately their feelings towards the Palestinians don't extend to the point where they would actually look at what's going on in Syria or what's going on in Lebanon, and they only hyper-focus in on Israel. I also think it's easier to focus in on Israel because Israel would argue that it's a semi-Western country, and I think we feel like we could have more say if we attack a Western country because they actually care about what the world thinks, whereas Assad, you can protest against him all you want, but I don't think Assad's sitting there worried about what students on a UK campus think about his regime. So there are people, I think, who genuinely care. And I think, in fact, there are a lot of people who buy in to Apartheid Week or buy into the BDS anti-Israel movement just because they tug at their heartstrings, and they're incredibly effective at this, right? I mean, the street theater that we saw in that video of, people being beaten and their mouths being taped, that is to draw out an emotional response, and any human would be drawn to that. I'm drawn to Palestinian suffering when I see things like that, but I also know the whole story. And then I also think there are people who, unfortunately, look, anti-Semitism is an age-old disease. It's something that has existed from the beginning of the Jewish people, and it's not going anywhere. And so I do also think there are people who do this because they are anti-Semitic at their core, and they just don't even know it. I mean, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the UK, said that, one of the craziest phenomenons is that throughout history, anti-Semites never acknowledged that they were anti-Semites. They always said, no, I don't hate Jews, I just hate their religion. Or I don't hate Jews, I just hate their race. And today it's, I don't hate Jews, I just hate their nation state. It's just other forms of anti-Semitism. And when people say to me, no, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just an anti-Zionist. Well, I say, this is a perversion of the word. Zionism is defined as an ideology that believes in a self-determination for the Jewish people in their historic homeland. So I say to somebody, if you are an anti-Zionist, that means you are against self-determination for the Jewish people. Now, are you against anybody else's self-determination? If you're not, you are singling out Jews for bigotry, and that's what we call anti-Semitism. And so anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's just another form of it, and it's become politically correct. It's okay to say I'm an anti-Zionist. It's not okay to say I'm an anti-Semite. So we need to redefine that word. If somebody says to me, I'm just against Israeli policies, the Israeli government policies, I look at them and I say, you're not an anti-Zionist. In fact, you would join about half of Israelis who also disagree with Israeli government policy as an active democracy where we have an opposition and we have people who disagree. But that's not an anti-Zionist. And every time you say that, you denigrate the word Zionism, you remove the meaning, and you make it okay to be anti-Semitic in this day and age. It's okay to be against Israeli policy. That is not anti-Semitic. It is anti-Semitic when you are against the existence of the State of Israel.
And Jonathan, you've organised a new campaign called Peace Week. Describe to us the objectives of this campaign and how through this campaign you want to highlight the mistruths and the lies and the myths behind Israel Apartheid Week.
Absolutely. So as part of our mission in Stand With Us to educate and believe that education is the road to peace, what we want to do is really empower students and increase the level of education and change the way that the discourse about Israel is handled on campus. So there's a few things that students have often tell us is their experience on campus when discussing Israel, and that is not being invited to any discussions that relate to Israel, that they are excluded from any discussions because there's a fear that as somebody who is Jewish, they might offer a perspective or concrete evidence that goes against the predominant narrative, that they are rejected by often student unions and leadership for telling Israel's story, and in the worst cases they're shut down very actively, that their voices are actually silenced by the worst of student unions and universities. So what we do is we say, well, let's fight against that. Let's empower students to create events and activities which engage proactively the wider student community, not just those that are pro-Israel, but those who have no opinion and have some opinion but really need the facts to be able to understand the wider context of what these accusations mean and where they're illegitimate and where they mischaracterize the conflict.
So let's have a look now at this excellent video produced by Stand With Us UK that looks at this new initiative called Peace Week.
I'm listening because it's only through listening that we can learn. By listening to other people, we get to understand their points of view, their ideas and what makes them tick. And it's only by doing that that we can better inform our own points of view, better inform our own convictions and better understand what's going on around us. That's why I'm choosing to listen so that I can learn.
Peace Week UK is Stand With Us UK's national campaign to promote meaningful dialogue across university campuses. Throughout the month of February, using the hashtag #I'mListening, we're calling on you to share with us why you're choosing to engage with your peers about the conflict rather than shut them down. I'm choosing to listen because I want to learn and gain an empathy for other opinions and perspectives that are not my own.
#I'mListening because at my university, events have been cancelled and conversations have been shut down. I believe that if we create a space where everyone, no matter what side they have taken, can come together and talk, and dialogue can help us and we could work together.
I'm listening because I believe that understanding one another and trying to engage with diverse opinions that we might not necessarily agree with is so important.
good to see that Stand With Us are making a difference at our British universities where the truth about Israel needs to be told. Charlotte, we're down to the last 5 minutes of the programme. I could do a whole programme with just you, with what you know and your insight and your knowledge, which is fantastic. But in terms of our viewers watching, and many of them may have grandchildren, they have sons and daughters at universities, how can we get young people involved with Israel? Because Israel is dynamic, it's an exciting place. I'd say it's a country for young people once people go. And that kind of breaks a lot of the perceptions about Israel, which is different. So can you really inspire some of our viewers to get involved with Israel, and particularly if they're students, how they can get involved with Stand With Us?
Sure. So first of all, Israel is an incredible place, and I think it doesn't get the credit that it is due. Yes, we have a conflict. It is part of our lives, but it is not our lives. There's so much more going on there, from the thriving culture that you see in a city like Tel Aviv, where you have the incredible beaches, where you have amazing nightlife, a startup nation like none other, entrepreneurship. I mean, there are so many avenues in which young people can find a shared value with Israel. Be it, again, entrepreneurship, the environmentalism. Tel Aviv has become one of the most vegan-friendly cities in the world. There's so many other aspects of Israel that are just really incredible, and those stories aren't told because they're drowned out by the conversation of the conflict. So one, I would just say, learn more about Israel. Go to Israel, see it with your own eyes, explore it, and explore that side, explore the conflict, see the whole picture. And when it comes to getting more active, I think it's really simple. We want to be on the right side of history, and there are people who take part in it, who write history, and there are bystanders. And I think a big part of this is not to be a bystander. There is anti-Semitism going on here. There is hatred going on here. And Jews can stand up and we can shout at the rooftops trying to get people to realize that that's what it is. But if somebody else steps up and who's not Jewish and says, I will not stand for this, this is unacceptable, I will not stand for this kind of hatred to exist in my society, in my world, on my campus, regardless of whether you're Jewish or affiliated, do it because it's the right thing to do. Because vile hatred might start with the Jews, it doesn't end with the Jews. It makes its way to other minorities, it makes its way to other groups. And so don't just stand up when it's you. Stand up because we don't want to live in a world where this kind of vile hatred exists. And then also do it because it is an inspiring place and it's an inspiring story. You know, I'm a Jew, and one of the first things I always say to my students is know your story. And the simple fact is that Israel is a miracle. The fact that Jews have lived there for 3,000 years, uninterrupted, most of the time though living in exile, suffering persecution, and somehow 2,000 years later we made our way back. And I say to my students, it is miraculous that I live in a city called Jerusalem, where on a daily basis sometimes they are digging up coins that on it is a language that I can read, because my people lived there 3,000 years ago. It is an inspiring, compelling story to tell, and is one that should be supported because it is really the story of a persecuted people finding liberation in their homeland. And that's the story that needs to be told. And again, it's an inspiring one. And it should inspire not just Jews, but it should inspire the world that there's a people suffering this type of persecution who can rise from those ashes. So go and explore and learn about Israel, and Stand With Us is here always as a resource to do that. Getting involved with our fellowship, getting involved, coming to Israel, always pop into the Stand With Us Israel office in Jerusalem. We're here to help, and just do your part. Be a history maker, not a bystander.
Excellent, well done, great speech, thank you. And Jonathan, in about a minute, I mean, you are inspired to stand with Israel because of your Christian conviction. So can you have any advice for Christians on university campus where there isn't an Israeli society, and how important it is to make a righteous stand for Israel at campus?
I would say for a Christian who wants to make a difference on campus, being motivated by their faith, there is no better avenue than caring for the Jewish people and doing that by standing up for Israel. The way that Israel discussion is taken on campus is violent and horrible, and Jewish people a lot of the time feel targeted. It is such a blessing you can be to your campus and to this Jewish student community by saying, as a Christian, I'm going to stand for Israel and do that because of my Christian faith.
Jonathan, Charlotte, thank you for an inspirational and a fantastic programme. Thank you both. And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. If you're a student at university and you love Israel and the Jewish people, you have no excuse. Stand up for Israel on campus, tell the truth about Israel on campus, and get involved with Stand With Us so that you know and you can tell other fellow students against the lies and the misinformation that lies behind the horrible and shocking Israel Apartheid week. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
No. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was. For 2,000 years the Jews all roamed, but we always called Israel our home. Unlike the British and Dutch who came to South Africa where they had no claim. They already had countries overseas, but they wanted to expand with new colonies, so they conquered the natives, bought and sold their land they stole, full of diamonds and gold. The whites united and decided to create South Africa as a democratic state, but soon they denied blacks voting rights, so the whole government was controlled by whites. The House and the Senate and all of the courts were white, so the black people got no support. Plus the police would arrest and beat any peaceful protesters in the street. They divided everybody into 4 different races, moved them by force into separate places. So if you were Indian, black or brown, you had no business in no white town. They had segregation of transportation, buses, bus stops, trains and train stations, separate ambulance, different doctor and nurse, and the black hospitals were always worse. Restaurants, hotels, and the public park might be off limits if your skin was dark. It was a crime, and you could get more than a fine if you crossed the line of that whites only sign. They had separate teachers at different schools, black and white beaches and swimming pools, cafes and movie theaters wouldn't let folks in, discriminating if they had the wrong color skin. No mixed marriage, it was a criminal act for a white person to have sex with a black. Apartheid went from the womb till the tomb, couldn't even take a dump in the same bathroom. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was. In Israel, apartheid is not the case, cause regardless of gender, religion, or race, all Israeli citizens, black, brown, and white, have equal social and political rights. So the Arab Israeli population, which makes up 20% of the nation, might be a minority, but at least they can vote, unlike the rest of the Middle East. Look at the whole region, you'll see only Israel is truly a democracy, where every citizen's right to vote is protected and Arab officials often get elected. That's an important point, let me stress it. There's a dozen Arabs with seats in the Knesset, plus an Arab judge on the Supreme Court, so they don't fall short on government support. Everyone has access to the same schools, same beaches and the same swimming pools, the same resorts and hotel guest rooms, same public parks and public restrooms, same cinemas, restaurants, cafes, same trains, buses, taxis, and highways, same doctors and nurses. All deliveries of babies are done in the same facilities. Arab Israeli life expectancy's rate up by 27 years since 1948, and their infant mortality rates have declined from 32 per thousand to less than 9, and they're doing much better economically relative to every other Arab country. There's no restriction on choice of career. They're welcome in the military if they volunteer. They can work and reside wherever they please, from Eilat all the way to the Sea of Galilee. They live the very same cities as Jews, on the same street, in the same house if they choose. People say Israel's an apartheid state, but I can't relate to that baseless hate. It's not really fair to try and compare a racist regime with the war on terror. Using common sense against violence, Israel had to build up the border fence. And if you think that's apartheid, it's because you don't know what apartheid really was.